Hello, my name is Michael Carr, and I've been investigating this topic of the relationship between the United States and China for about 50 years, on and off. Most of what I'm going to talk about has been investigated by the LaRouche movement in general. There's a few new things which I'm going to mention, but mostly it's stuff which we have investigated over a long period of time. There are even some people in this room that investigated some of these aspects. So we're going to primarily be going through some slides. I've got about 90 slides, and we're going to go through them. Some are quick slides, and some will take a little bit longer. So first off, I'm going to ask you, who are these three people, and where are they? Well, if you already know, you can't say. You have to say. You can't say. Solon, yeah, Solon's on the right. Who's in the middle? Moses, right. Okay, and who's on the left? Confucius, that's right. So where are they, though?
In the Supreme Court.
That's right, the United States Supreme Court, in the pediment on the east side of the U.S. Supreme Court building. So why do you think they're there?
Lawgivers.
Yeah, they're lawgivers.
Justice.
But why is Confucius there? You probably wouldn't have expected that, right? So this is, Confucius had many dialogues and questions and answers mainly, and this is one which I use as an example. If a ruler rectifies his own conduct, government is an easy matter. And if he does not rectify his own conduct, how can he rectify others? You see that Benjamin Franklin, in 1757, he published many writings of Confucius. This is from something called The Morals of Confucius. There are various books that you can get and read about, but the principle that Benjamin Franklin found of interest is the fact that Confucius, like Socrates and other people previously, was aiming to figure out what the truth is, and thinking about things from the standpoint of the long term, not what's happening today, what's happening tomorrow, but the long term. So we're living right now in a time where the ideas which Confucius and other people, but especially Lyndon LaRouche, are coming to a fruition. He has been promoting the idea for decades now that the United States, Russia, China, and India, by combining their forces, would be powerful enough to overthrow the British Empire. And the British Empire is not the Royal Navy. The British Empire is this. The British Empire is the financial system that runs most of the world. No credit unless you're going to use credit to destroy something. No truth. No, as far as they're concerned, they wish all outlets of truth to be shut down, including the president's Twitter feed. No sovereignty for anyone, no industry, no people, no future. This is Mark Carney. He's the governor of the Bank of England, and he and 130 other banks are pushing the idea that everyone should be starved of credit except for people who are going to build windmills or solar panels, things like that. But otherwise, the world economy should be shut down. So you hear the term the deep state, things like that. It's not the deep state, it's the British Empire. So in the past several weeks, though, we've had a series of very important events which demonstrate the fact that this four-power alliance that LaRouche proposed is coming into fruition. Just the other day, we had the agreement between LaRouche and President Trump for the first phase of a trade agreement between the United States and China. He said, well, you know, we've had a rough period of time here. You know, people were saying, well, we've got planes, we got ships. They were saying they got planes, they got ships, but now it's a real love fest. That's what he said. So that's a good indication of what's going on. Then you have the situation here wherein President Putin and President Trump coordinated a strategy to allow this mess in Syria to be more or less straightened out, and that Syria will be able to retain its sovereignty, and Turkey will be able to prevent Kurdish terrorists operating inside Syria from attacking Turkey. And hopefully this is all about to work out, and it's an example of what can be accomplished all around the world where there are such problems. Then, what was it, 3 weeks ago, the president was here with the Prime Minister of India, Modi, and it was practically like Modi was telling all the Indian American people to vote for Trump. It was quite something. And just before that, the president had given a speech at the United Nations, and he said the future does not belong to globalists, it belongs to patriots. And we were outside, you know, as we usually are at the United Nations when everybody gets together in September, when the leaders of the world come to speak at the United Nations. And the diplomats were all telling us how excited they were about this speech that the president gave, and we didn't think it was the greatest speech because he said a few things that we wouldn't agree with, but he said this, and all of the diplomats were telling us, well, that was a great speech. And the reason they thought it was a great speech is because it indicates that the United States is returning to its long-term foreign policy and turning away from, you know, pretty much 70 years of policy dominated by, more than 70 years, dominated by British manipulation of the United States. I mean, this American foreign policy was best enunciated by John Quincy Adams. Excuse me. He gave a speech on the 4th of July in 1821, and this is a little quote from it. He says, "But she," that means the United States, "does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but she is the champion and vindicator only of her own." And 2 years later, he wrote the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told the European colonial powers that any attempt to recolonize areas which had become independent in South America would be considered an unfriendly act by the United States. And even though the United States was not in a position to do anything to defend these countries as they became independent, it was pointing out to the Europeans that it was greatly to be discouraged from the standpoint of the United States. It was something that was that they should not engage in. So here you have a map. Here you see all of the blue. Mexico was starting to become independent around 1810. In that period of time, right before this, you had what's now Argentina and Colombia, Venezuela, those areas, and then a little later, Brazil, and Bolivia. But you had this process of nation states being formed in South America and south of the border, as we say. Of course, the border wasn't there then. The border was further north. But anyway, the Hispanic part of America.
French Guinea is still a colony.
Yeah, French Guinea is still a colony, but you know.
British?
Well, they launched the Ariane rockets are launched from there. Anyway, everybody should be very happy about the fact that we just had the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and it reflects the long-term inclination of the United States. On the 50th anniversary, this is 1999, Lyndon LaRouche, when he was still alive, he said this: "I would hope that I, for my part, must succeed in contributing to the birth of China's natural friend and partner. My United States, which is the United States which President Abraham Lincoln described in his 1863 Gettysburg Address." So we just had the 70th anniversary. They had parades all over China. They released an interesting movie, which we recommend people go to see. It's called My People, My Country. It tells the story of 7 significant events in the history of modern China from the standpoint of some of the people involved in those situations. And they have some very unusual twists. The people in China are very much like the people in America, but they also have some things which Americans would think are a little, or have some philosophical outlooks on things which are slightly different, which causes it to be very interesting to an American. So I encourage everyone to go see this movie. But our direct relations with China, the United States' direct relations with China, began by a converted ship which was used as a privateer, I guess is the best word for it. It was converted in 1784. Now this is before the Constitutional Convention, so this is under the Articles of Confederation, when the Congress couldn't agree on anything. But anyway, somehow they agreed that they were going to send a ship over to China, because previously all of our trade had to go through London, and we could not directly trade with anyone, which is one of the reasons for the American Revolution. So anyway, so they took skins, ginseng, cotton, cloth, and pepper. They had 30 tons of ginseng, 2,600 skins, and they came back with tea, nankin. Nankin was a yellowish cloth from China, tableware, silk, and spices. It was a 14-month round trip, and trade grew slightly over time. It wasn't, it wasn't very convenient to go to China, but the things you brought back from China were unique. After the first British East India Company Opium War against China, which took place 1839 to 1842, and ended up with the first of what China calls the unequal treaties, the U.S. government continued to prohibit the opium trade. Now, I have to say, the United States government prohibited the opium trade, but there were people on the east coast of the United States who are, up to this, their families are still allied to the British Empire, and part of the problem that we have, there are families who were involved in an illegal trade wherein they were bringing opium from Turkey and or Iran and taking it into China in coordination with the British. So this is one of the institutions which has led to the corruption of the United States. So William Weld, who was involved in prosecuting LaRouche and putting LaRouche in prison, and who the other day basically said the president should be executed, he's from one of those families, and that gives you some idea about what you're dealing with. But anyway, in 1844, the U.S. And China signed a treaty called the Treaty of Wanghia, and if someone knows better how to pronounce these names than I encourage you to step up here and pronounce them better, because I don't make any claims to good pronunciation. Anyway, in this treaty, the Chinese asked that the United States intervene for the Chinese in disputes with other Western countries, like, for example, with the British. And it also allowed construction of American schools, hospitals, and churches in ports that were open for trade.
The ports of China.
The ports of China, right. In 1861, Prince Gong was put in charge of foreign relations. China began to realize that it needed to have a foreign institution to deal with foreigners. Anyway, so Prince Gong consulted very often with the U.S. envoy Burlingame. And when Burlingame was preparing to leave to go back to the United States, Gong asked him to represent China. And this is a picture of Anson Burlingame. He was sent by Lincoln and Seward. Seward was very interested in developing relations with China. So he led this China's first foreign mission to the world, and first they came to the United States. A treaty known as the Burlingame Treaty recognized the United States and China as equals. It granted the right of Chinese people to come to America and American people to go to China, not just inside the ports. And then he went on to Europe to represent China in Europe and in Russia. He died in the middle of the mission, I think in Russia. But in 1901, at a Lincoln birthday celebration, Wu Ting-fan, who was the Chinese minister to the United States at that time, he said a couple things which are of significance to us. The signing of the Burlingame Treaty was the first attempt on the part of a Western power to apply the principles of reciprocity in dealing with the government and people of China. And he said that missionaries are reported to have said that the name American has often proved to be a veritable aegis to them in time of popular excitement. He was referring to the Boxer Rebellion, but we'll get to the Boxer Rebellion in a little while here. But
I'm sorry, what does the word aegis mean?
aegis means shield,
Oh, okay.
like those Aegis missiles, the Aegis missile system. You've heard of that, right? Okay. All right. So then, as part of this, so now Chinese people were allowed to come to America, and American people were allowed to go to China. So the Chinese educational mission began in 1872. There were 120 students for starters, and this was the first batch of them there. A couple of them went on to college. Here's a couple with red circles there who were in a science class at Yale. And now we have 360,000 students. And somebody asked President Trump about that the other day, and President Trump said, yes, we want these people coming from China and from wherever who want to study at our good universities. Now, our universities are not as good as they should be, because but we'll get into that. We'll get into that a little later. Anyway, so after President Grant served his two terms as president, he took a roughly 2-year trip around the world. Went to Europe, went to Egypt and India, Thailand. He went into China and he spent some time there. And here he is meeting with Li Hongxiang, who at the time he was not the emperor, but he was the person who acted as the prime minister and basically ran the government and international relations. And there was a dispute, and I think the same dispute exists today between China and Japan over the Ryukyu Islands, I think they're called by Japan. But anyway, they had a dispute, and there was a threat of war, and Li Hongxiang asked President Grant, who was just a private citizen at the time, to represent China as he went on to Japan, because from China he was heading on to Japan, and to try to encourage the Japanese people not to attack China and start a war, because this is what President Grant said about it, and he said this to the Japanese, so bear that in mind. So when he got to Japan, he wrote this, and he verbally spoke this to all the people he spoke with in Japan, including the emperor. He says, "Your quarrels are their opportunity for unfriendly intervention. And if war should ensue between the two countries, that is, Japan and China, the powers of Europe will end it in their own way, in their own interests, and to the lasting and incalculable injury of both nations. America has great commercial interests in the Far East, but she has no interests and can have none that are inconsistent with the complete independence and well-being of all Asiatic nations, especially Japan and China. It seems that rights, which Western nations all regard as sacred and inviolable, because absolutely essential to their independence and dignity, would not be denied by them to China and Japan. American statesmen have long since perceived the danger of European interference in the political affairs of North and South America. So guard against this danger, and as a measure of self-protection, it has become the settled policy of the United States that no European power shall be permitted to enlarge its dominion in American affairs. It is likewise the policy of America in the Orient that the integrity and independence of China and Japan should be preserved and maintained." So they didn't have a war then, and that was a good thing.
Who was it that said that?
President Grant.
It was just Grant.
But he was a private citizen at the time, right? Okay, so then this is another American person of interest here. He was involved in construction projects in Russia, but in 1886 and 87, he signed a deal with the Chinese Empire to set up a national bank to be entitled the Chinese American Bank. It was modeled on the Alexander Hamilton Bank, and a national railroad, telegraph, and telephone system to cover the bulk of the populated parts of China. And his intention was the accomplishment of the common work of Russia and America, namely the dismemberment of the British Empire. Okay, there's a theme in all of this, which is that those of us who aren't part of the British Empire have a great common interest in getting rid of it once and for all. So anyway, so as I said, we had the right of people from China to come to America and the right of Americans to go to China. So when the United States embarked on this project that Lincoln had set up for the Transcontinental Railroad, there was a great shortage of people out on the West Coast to do the labor, and someone suggested, well, maybe we can get people from China to come here and help. And so they did a test with some Chinese workers and some other American workers, and even though the Chinese people tended to be a few inches shorter than the other people, the Chinese people did as well or better than the gringos, you know. And so the Chinese workers became the preferred grouping of people to build railroads, and there was pretty much about 80% Chinese people involved in building of the transcontinental railroads, all of them, not just the first one. This is here in our Herman Park in the Centennial Garden. This is about the Southern Pacific, and I'll just read what it says there because it's not so easy for you to read it. It says, on the dawn of January 12th, 1883, in Eagle's Nest, Texas, the final tie of the railroad joining the Pacific to the Gulf Coast was laid with a silver spike out of the many who accepted the challenge of the completion of the Southern Pacific Railroad. One self-sacrificing group of individuals ensured its success. The Chinese, without their tireless efforts and dauntless determination, the railroad, which started Houston and the Gulf on the way to its present position of prominence as America's lifeline for growth, would have been seriously delayed. This monument serves not only as a dedication to the significance of the event, but also to the vital contributions of the 3,000 Chinese workers who helped to make the American dream possible for all Houstonians. So that was placed there on the centennial of January 12, 1983. but there were also other problems. There was some low points here too. So, so there were people encouraging Chinese people to come to the United States, and then there were organized crime networks, especially something known as the triads, who were using the opium trade to basically kidnap people and bring them over here when they were, under the influence of opium, things like that, right? So it's sort of the kind of thing that the president is right now talking about with our border problems, organized crime networks trafficking people into the United States for illegal purposes, things like that. So anyway, so there was that, and then there was also, well, there was one case in Massachusetts, I believe. There was a strike, and the company brought in Chinese people to replace the workers who had been working there, and they forced the workers not only to stop striking but to take a 10% wage cut. So anyway, this caused quite a bit of kerfuffle, or anyway, it created a bit of friction between the United States and China, and it ended up sabotaging the projects that we talked about earlier of building the National Bank and the railroad and the telephone and telegraph system for China. That sabotaged that. But there was also a similar kind of thing that happened in China, where you had a Boxer rebellion against the influence of foreigners inside China, where this is what was referred to earlier, that a secret society called the Boxers was starting a revolt, and they were blaming problems on foreigners, and they were going around killing Chinese people who had become Christians and other foreigners. But if you were to...
It sounds like it's the same operation that's being run right now.
Yeah,
And,
it's
you know,
right.
The bankers working with the mob.
Right. It's the same kind of problems by the same institutions, but we have to take note of this while we discuss this. So, this is a plaque in front of the place where the Schiller Houston Community Chorus practices, and it's about the fact that, given all of this, there was some discrimination against Chinese people in especially the southern western part of the United States. But Houston was a place where if you were Chinese, you could go to school and you wouldn't be persecuted, whereas in many other places you couldn't. So there began to be a Chinese community develop here inside Houston, and there was political activity to reverse the discriminatory things which had occurred here and elsewhere. And in 1965, Immigration Act opened the doors and allowed many more people to come here from China and other places. Okay, so also in about that time frame, the European powers were basically trying to cut up China and give China the Africa treatment, which we'll get to in a moment. But Secretary of State Hay, who had been secretary to Lincoln when Lincoln was president, and he was now Secretary of State under McKinley, he sent out a note which became known as the open door policy, which basically told the European powers that the United States saw any attempt to cut up China as a big mistake, and it was against the policy of the United States for such a thing to take place. And it's one of the reasons, as we said before, that if you were a foreigner in China in the middle of the Boxer Rebellion and you told the Boxers that you were American, they would maybe not kill you, maybe not. Meanwhile, in 1884, 1885, you had this conference in Berlin of the European powers which cut up Africa, and this is this is what you see here, and the only places that weren't cut up were Ethiopia, which is over there in the east, and in the west was Liberia. But everything else was divided up. And that's the opposite policy to the policy that the United States was pushing, of independence and sovereignty. Okay, now there's another country that has had a mostly positive relationship with China, almost as good as the United States, and that's Russia. So here we have Count Sergei Witte. He became the railroad minister, and then later on the prime minister of Russia. He was a student of Friedrich List, who was a German-American economist who was responsible for setting up the customs union in Germany that led to the unification of Germany and the development of German railroads. But anyway, Count Sergei Witte, he was the man behind the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which took from 1891 to 1916 to build. And then he also built the Chinese Eastern Railroad around the turn of the century. And I'll show you the map here. Now, this is the Russian map, but I'm showing you this in this way because you can see the colors. The green is Russia, the gray is China, and Mongolia is yellow there. That's the area known as Manchuria. Now here you can see it in English, but you don't see the colors, so I can't give you everything all the time. All right, so then also around that time frame, you had Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen's brother was he was a laborer, one of those people like the people we saw in the picture earlier. He was a laborer who was working in Hawaii, which was then an American territory. And his brother brought him over to Hawaii, and he studied in various schools and so forth, went back to China, came back to Hawaii. But anyway, he was basically taught by some British schools and some American missionaries. That's a whole separate story about the missionaries. But anyway, in 1894, he founded the Renew China Society, sort of like Make China Great Again in Hawaii. And he became the first president of the new republic. But he was only president for about 2 months, and we'll get to that in a moment. But he had visions which were very much American-style visions for the development of China. You see there, we have a quote there: "Our projected railway will form a part of the trunk line of the Eurasian system, which will connect the two populous centers, Europe and China, together." He organized his movement around three principles that are outlined in the Gettysburg Address of Lincoln, which was government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the Chinese version of that became known as the three principles of the people. And Sun Yat-sen is he's venerated both on the western side of the Taiwan Strait and the eastern side of the Taiwan Strait by the communists and the old Republic of China people, as well as the founder of modern China. This is a monument, his mausoleum in China, where his birthplace is.
The one on the right?
The one on the right. The one on the left, you should know. I expect you to know the one on the left. The one on the left is in Washington, the Lincoln Memorial. Okay. Anyway, this is the book, The Vital Problem of China, which we republished about 20 years ago. He says, "The key policy of England is to attack the strongest country with the help of the weaker countries," is your basic imperial strategy. And here is his railroad map that he had outlined the development of railroads for China. And you see the modern rail network isn't quite as dense as his network in the western part, but they're working on it. He also wanted to build a big dam on the Yangtze, and the Three Gorges Dam was finally completed in 2014. and that also had American input into that. A bunch of engineers came over here from China to study the TVA, and some people from the Bureau of Reclamation went over to China to look at this, and even in the middle of World War II, this was being discussed. But anyway, back to Sun Yat-sen. Okay, so this guy, Yuan Shikai, is the reason that Sun Yat-sen was only president for 2 months, because he had built the relatively modern army of the Qing dynasty, and he was put in charge of wiping out Sun Yat-sen's republic. But he negotiated with Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen agreed to withdraw as president and let this guy Yuan Shikai become president, as long as he got rid of the empire. So he agreed to do that, and he became president. And then this guy was sort of an operator, this Yuan Shikai, and he tried to make himself emperor. And many of the people who had been part of his army, leaders of his army, didn't agree with that. And anyway, that became a period of warlordism in China, where you had these warring armies, basically. They were all Chinese, but they were all arguing about who should be in charge of China. So it was a very terrible time.
What years are these?
Well, this is from till about 1937. From 1912, 1912 is when he became technically the president. And I don't know every detail, but it's from 1912 to 1937 is a period that China was very disunified, and there was a lot of warfare and a lot of problems. And in the midst of it, you had World War I, and China had sent, wasn't actively involved in fighting, but it sent teams of workers to Europe to work with France and Britain, and so they were sort of allied with the winners of World War I. And when the Versailles Treaty was agreed to, the territory which had previously been sort of dominated by Germany, the Shantung Peninsula, where Tsingtao, you know that beer, Tsingtao beer? Yeah, okay, well anyway, everywhere the Germans went, they built, everywhere the Germans, if I mispronounced it, tell me the right way, because I don't.
You did it right.
Oh, Tsingtao, okay, okay. Well anyway, everywhere the Germans went, they built breweries. But so in the Versailles Treaty, even though Wilson, who was not a good guy, but he was against this, but anyway, it went through that Japan was supposed to take over this territory that had been dominated by the Germans. And so there was a big student protest on May 4th, 1919, and this led over time to about 1921, the formation of what is now called the Communist Party of China, the ruling party, the ruling apparatus. So that's important. So anyway, also in 1937, you had the Japanese invasion. You had the Sino-Japanese War. And Franklin Roosevelt sent this man, he was lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps at the time, he sent him over to find out everything that could be found out about the capabilities of the Chinese and the Japanese armies. And the Chinese armies were basically dominated by two different groups. You had the group around Chiang Kai-shek, who was nominally the head of China, but you also had the grouping around the Communist Party of China, which is primarily the Chinese Eighth Route Army. Anyway, he learned a lot about all of these things, but he learned the most from the Chinese Eighth Route Army, which was the Communist Army led by Ted, Mao Zedong, and people like that. And he applied lessons that he learned there to the U.S. Marine Corps. So if you've ever heard the term gung-ho, he's the one who brought that term into the United States. Gung-ho means working together, more or less. And in the Chinese 8th Route Army, the principles that every person in the Army had to be involved in was studying, reading, learning to read, because most people didn't know how to read to begin with. They had to be taught how to read. Honesty, humility, cooperation, and no distinctions for the officers, that the officers and the men treated themselves. The officers were there to serve the men who were in their army. And Carlson brought that principle to the Marine Corps, and he wrote a book about this, and he was sending letters back to Franklin Roosevelt every week or so, as Franklin Roosevelt asked him to do. And so he noticed that there was this problem, that Sun Yat-sen had warned about the tradition in China of putting loyalty to a clan above loyalty to the state. And this was a problem that Chiang Kai-shek had, because he was nominally the leader of all of the Chinese, but in reality, very few people in the various armies that were supposedly under his command were actually loyal to him. And they had their own, everybody had their own angle. And so therefore, he saw that the fighting potential of the communist army was probably greater than that of the Chiang Kai-shek. This is the book that he wrote. He resigned for a little while, and then he came back. He was put in charge of this 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, and they launched the first attack on Chinese-held territory, an island in the Pacific, in 42, that is. So anyway, also in 1941, this is after Pearl Harbor. If I'm going through history pretty quickly here, and so if I'm getting anything messed up or you have any questions, feel free to ask. Anyway, January 41, the State of the Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt laid out these 4 principles of American foreign policy: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And then a few months later, in August, he met with Churchill in Argentia off Newfoundland, and basically he forced Churchill to agree to the U.S. foreign policy demands in something called the Atlantic Charter, that if the United States was going to help the British to win the war, not that we were sending men, but we were sending lend-lease and things like that. In order for the United States to do this, the United States was not going to be backing up the maintenance of the empire or expansion of the British Empire. So several things were done here. Claire Chennault was sent by the Republic of China people to the United States to lobby for getting volunteers and also equipment to help the Chinese to fight the Japanese.
Monroe, Louisiana.
Yeah, there's a monument to him there. There's monuments all over in China to him also, but
yeah, he's
but
very famous in China also.
yeah, he's very famous, right? Anyway, so he got the United States government to agree to send 100 of these P-40s, and we got 90-some pilots to volunteer from the Army Air Corps, and they began putting up some resistance.
Well, they were technically mercenaries at that time.
Right, they were not. They had to
were not
resign from the Army, from the U.S. Army,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had to enlist in the Chinese Air Force. So So similarly here, this is in the same time frame. This is the draft of what the Bretton Woods agreement was supposed to be oriented towards, and you see the contradiction between this and like what the IMF said the other day. The IMF was pushing the idea that heavy taxes should be put on producers of carbon dioxide, so coal, oil, basically to make things so to make it so that industry has to shut down and people can't live, essentially. But anyway, I'm going to read this because it gives a pretty good idea of what the United States was really trying to do. It is true that rich and powerful countries can for long periods safely and easily ignore the interests of poor or weaker neighbors or competitors, but by doing so, they only imperil the future and reduce the potential of their own level of prosperity. The lesson that must be learned is that prosperous neighbors are the best neighbors, that a higher standard of living in one country begets higher standards in others, and that a high level of trade and business is most easily attained when generously and widely shared. So that was what the Bretton Woods, the philosophy was supposed to be for the Bretton Woods. So anyway, so by 1943, here you have Chiang Kai-shek, Franklin Roosevelt, and Churchill at a meeting in Cairo. And Churchill was totally outraged because as far as he was concerned, China was just like India or some other place that should be subjected to imperial control. And Franklin Roosevelt demanded that China be given a status as a major power in the world, and this was one.
Say that, who that was again? The next Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt?
Chiang Kai-shek, he's the nominal head of China. And at that time, even the communists, looked at him as being the central figure of China. And they, it was a very difficult time for all of them. But anyway, he was nominally the leader of this. So anyway, in the middle of this, this is where Lyndon LaRouche comes in, because in 1944, he was part of the American, he's in uniform there, standing out in the snow in Massachusetts there. Yeah. But it's a terrible picture, but it's the only picture that I know about of LaRouche from about that time. Anyway, so he was sent on this mission basically to defend China. He was sent to what was called the China-Burma-India Theater. So here on this map, well, first let me say, so the Japanese they'd taken over all the ports of China on the Pacific, and at that time the only way to get to get supplies into China from the United States or anywhere else was to go through Burma and the Burma Road that led to Kunming, which was in southwest China. So the Japanese then launched an attack and took over Burma, in which case there was basically no way to get to China, to get goods over to China. So the first thing that was done was an airlift was set up over part of the Himalayas, and it was calculated by Chenault that it took 18 barrels of oil to get 1 ton of, or 18, let's put it this way, 18 tons of oil to get 1 ton of bombs deposited on the Japanese, because this was such an inefficient system. And so what was organized under General Stilwell, who was an American general he was put under Chiang Kai-shek's command. He was supposed to be the chief of staff, and the United States was supposed to train 30 divisions of Chinese troops. But anyway, for starters, two divisions were trained, and they retook northern Burma, and they began the process of building this road. And here you can see the road. It comes from India there at Lido. Can you see that up there?
No?
Okay. Okay, so they had to build a new road to connect up with the old road here, okay, to come from India. There's another map here, I think, which might, well, that's, here, this, I'll go back to this map. Okay, so this was the old way, was come up the railroad here and then take things across that road into Kunming, okay? So then when the Japanese took over here, we had the air route, then the Chinese and Americans, but mostly the Chinese troops, they succeeded in pushing the Japanese back down here, and began the building of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, basically, with Chinese and everybody they could get, Burmese, and they started building this road here. It became known as the Lido Road or the Stillwell Road. And this is a picture of what it looked like when it was finally finished.
Wow.
It's not like Texas. It's
straight.
it's not. Yeah, it's a very difficult road to build.
Wow.
But anyway, they built it, and they started shipping.
How far down is that cliff? That's
Well, it goes way down. I don't know, but that's just one picture. There's videos and whatnot you can see about the building of this road. But it was. This was the big fight to preserve China, to keep China independent, sovereign. It was quite an operation. So anyway, so the deal that had been worked out. This is I'll just read this paragraph here. This is from the Four Powers book that I had shown you earlier. This is from the introduction. In terms of China, the agreement which Roosevelt had worked out with Chiang Kai-shek was that Chiang and the Kuomintang, which is the grouping known as today, the grouping that controls Taiwan, would join with the Chinese communists and form a unity government to be followed by an election. The conditions for that were that the United States would not allow Britain to go back into Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, and also that the Soviet Union would agree that it would not take over Manchuria, and that Manchuria was part of China. And what happens after Roosevelt's death and after the war is over, the British ships go back to Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, or Canton, and the entire agreement was invalidated by the combination of Churchill and Truman. So things got messed up, but there were continuous attempts by the United States to try to unify China if it could be done. This is General Marshall there in the middle of the United States with a representative from Chiang Kai-shek and a representative from Mao Zedong. You know him, Zhou Enlai. Right. Then in 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Well, of course, before that, I guess I'm leaving out an important part there, which is that Chiang Kai-shek and his army and the army of Mao Zedong and Chu Te, they fought it out, and the Mao's party won, probably for the reasons that were given by Evans Carlson that we discussed earlier, that every person in that army knew what they were doing and why they were doing it, as opposed to the Republic of China army. You know, Evans Carlson reported that he had seen a troop of men, young men who were all chained together, and he asked what was that, and they said, well, that was the draft. They were drafting people for the anyway. So this is the founding of the People's Republic of China, which we just celebrated 70 years of. Okay. So then we had another low point here. This was, as we said, Truman was pretty much under the thumb of Churchill, more so than he should have been. And at a National Press Club briefing in 1950, the Secretary of State for Truman, Dean Acheson, excluded Korea from the Pacific areas of interest to the United States. So what happened was, and this is another Russian map, but anyway, you can't use every map you would like to use in publicly. they're not all publicly available to be used. They're copyrights and whatnot. But anyway, the basic thing was that Korea had been occupied by the Japanese. At the end of the war, the Russian or Soviet troops occupied the northern part, and the American troops occupied the southern part of Korea. And there was supposed to be a government formed, but the Soviets had their own idea about what a government should be, and then there was a second government set up in the southern part, and Kim Il-sung, who was the head of the republic in the north, invaded and drove the American troops back. There weren't very many troops there, but the ones that were there were driven back down to Busan, down at the bottom right there. And then the United Nations had a Security Council meeting and decided that this had to be stopped. And so MacArthur was put in charge. They landed over here at Incheon and started heading up to the border with China, and got up to the border of China, and from the standpoint of the Chinese, they considered this to be American aggression, and so they sent what they called volunteers to come back and to attack the United Nations forces, which were mostly Americans, but there were others as well. And then they drove the Americans.
Wait, what are those yellow areas?
Well, that's the part. Here, the green is the area controlled by the United Nations forces, or the people under MacArthur. So what's yellow there was what was left of Kim Il-sung's territory. Okay, the grandfather of Kim Jong-il.
Right.
Okay,
But
it's
that's
the
not
current.
today.
No, that's not today. No, this is 1950 to 1953. Okay, so anyway, the Chinese came back and launched a counterattack and surprised the Americans and the UN troops, because they didn't expect that the Chinese were going to get in on this, and they drove them back down. And then there was another counterattack, and then there was a stalemate, and Eisenhower was elected, and he said, I'll go to Korea and put an end to it, and he did. But in the middle of that, you had things like this. This is, I cannot pronounce this guy's name. If you can help me to pronounce his name. Chen Shushen, okay. Chen Shushen, okay. Chen Shushen, okay, he was American Army colonel in World War II, okay. He was one of the 3 people that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. But in the middle of all this stuff, where for the first time Chinese people and American people were fighting each other in this war, and there was all this hysteria about Chinese people and communism and this and that. Anyway, he was driven out of the United States by the FBI. But when he went to China, he founded the Chinese nuclear and space programs, the institutions that now, just landed on the backside of the moon, okay? And so it was a bad thing, but in the long term, if you think in the long, it was a good thing, because if it hadn't been for the Chinese developing their space program, we might not have ever gotten to the point of saying, hey, we got to get our space program going again. So it was kind of a bad thing, but
Well, ironic.
right. That's how smart the people at the FBI are. They're not very. The FBI is not very smart. So anyway, so we had some continued rough sailing, not just in terms of American relations with China, but China had terrible time, because the People's Republic of China initially was working with the Soviet Union. They got some help from the Soviet Union, and they had they had Soviet-style running of things. They had top-down managers, people who were engineers were running, setting up and running factories, and you had a decision that was taken that this was not really the right way to do things, that there should be more input from the workers. It shouldn't just be a top-down control. So you had political management that was brought in. You had other kinds of changes. You had attempts to replace capital with labor, and just by putting lots and lots of people into areas that you wanted to develop industrially. But resources were taken away from the agriculture, and you had several years of severe famines. And then from 1966 to 1976, roughly, you had this Cultural Revolution where everything was being attacked. Everything that was old was attacked, Confucius, etc. If you see the movie From Mao to Mozart, you get a pretty good idea of the kind of things that were going on. It's sort of like what is going on in the United States right now, that people are attacked for not having the politically correct ideas and this and that. Then there was a border war with the Soviet Union, and there was a punitive war against Vietnam because Vietnam had invaded what was then called Kampuchea or Cambodia. Anyway, it was not a good time. But in that time frame, Helga went on her first trip to China. This was before she married LaRouche. This is a picture of her there, and it's also not a very good
Second
picture.
from the left.
Well, right here, the tall person is Helga right there. And there's, it's not much of a picture either, but it is a picture. Yeah. So she said that when she was there, people were not very happy. They were very poor. It was a rough time. Anyway, this is 1972. Nixon goes to China and meets with Mao, and they begin this process of talking about conflicts and working out plans, trying to put the United States and China on a better footing. He had an idea that he intended to do this even before he was elected. But also in that time frame, LaRouche began to intervene into the situation, and he pushed a return of American methods not only in the United States but internationally, with how the International Development Bank will work. 1975, 1983, we had the 50-year development plan for the Indian Pacific Ocean Basin. These are some of the projects which he was pushing back then, some of which have been developed. There is a new Panama Canal, or expansion of the existing Panama Canal. The Great Canal in China has been expanded, and there are also two other big water projects that have been developed in China to bring water from the south to the north of China. So while there was all kinds of wild stuff that was going on inside the United States that moved the United States into the British domination, you had the Vietnam War, you had all kinds of crazy things. LaRouche stood up for the principles of the United States and what Franklin Roosevelt and John Quincy Adams and Grant and so forth had held forth. And for years he held periodic closed-door seminars with diplomats in Washington. And different countries would come to these events, but the People's Republic of China always came because they wanted to know. And by 1978, Deng Xiaoping, who had basically been second in command under Mao, he realized that when he came to power, after Mao had died and various things that happened that brought him to the top in China, he realized that mistakes had been made, and he reoriented the Communist Party around the production of wealth, not just redistribution of wealth. He said something to the effect that white cats and black cats are good cats as long as they catch mice. That if capitalism produces wealth, we need that. If communism produces or socialism produces wealth, we need that. But we need to produce wealth. That's the main thing. We can't survive by just redistributing poverty. So, and then in 1979, the United States recognized the People's Republic of China and the One China principle, which means that there's only one China, and that what is called the Republic of China is really should be part of the People's Republic of China. They have to work it out, but the United States agrees that China is the country that's centered in Beijing. So here you have some people you know there. There's the former head of the Johnson Space Center there, Chris Kraft, and Deng Xiaoping, and Senator John Glenn up there in the top left, and other people here. So in the 1979, Deng Xiaoping came here to Houston. Somebody gave him this hat, which Brian took a picture of when he was when he was over in China recently. Excuse me. So Deng Xiaoping set up special economic zones, which the first one was Shenzhen, which is just next to Hong Kong, and is now known as the Silicon Valley of hardware. It's the center of the high-tech industries of China, one of the main centers. In 1992, we put forward the proposal for the Eurasian Rail Corridor projects and development corridors. And later, by 1990, that's after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the borders were opened a little bit. And then in 1996, our friend Hal Cooper, who's a civil engineer specializing in railroad technology, put together this map for the whole world. And in 1996, Helga LaRouche spoke at the Beijing conference on the Continental Bridge. 2001, thanks. 2001, LaRouche was insisting that China had to shift from an export-based economy away from just setting up factories for other countries and other companies to export, but that it had to invest in its internal infrastructure and its internal labor power. So China adopted many of LaRouche's ideas, not probably all, but many of LaRouche's ideas were adopted. In 2007, there was zero miles of high-speed 0 miles of high-speed rail in China. And now we got well,
That's
it's 30,000, right? I misspelled it. It's 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, yeah. And now they're working on superconducting maglev, which is different than the Japanese system and different than the German system, but actually uses some of the methods used by the Japanese and the Germans, sort of a combination. It's a very interesting, anyway, I won't go into that, that's a whole separate thing. Anyway, 2008, Beijing held the World Olympics, and our friend from the consulate said that that during this process, the people from all over the world were in Beijing, but the people in Beijing wanted to talk to all these foreigners, but they really couldn't because hardly anybody knew English. And so at that point in 2008, the government decided that, well, everybody in China, all the kids, should be studying Mandarin and English. And so now there are 300 million students of English in China. Also, yeah, that's right. It's more than almost more than the whole United States. So that's a big change right there. So in 2013, in Kazakhstan, President Xi announced his initial ideas about the Belt and Road, what became the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is a map which reflects what he was talking about. And the weird thing is that the belt is the railroad, and the road is the maritime, and I don't know how it got translated that way, but there's a lot always lost in translation, you know. And also, Xi Jinping has been promoting the return of study of Confucius. So that's a very important thing. This is a statue that was recently built in Confucius's hometown there. It's the biggest statue of Confucius in the world. If you want to know more about what Xi Jinping is talking about, read this book. This is The Governance of China, first book. There's supposedly a second book too, but I haven't found it yet. But I read this. It's pretty interesting. You should read it. And meanwhile, we've been further elaborating our proposals, publishing on these things. So Brian back here he's done a lot of work on the banking system in China. This is what we're lacking in the United States. We do not have a credit system. But starting with Deng Xiaoping, you had a series of banks set up, and then with the Belt and Road Initiative, you had another series of banks that were set up that are Hamiltonian banks. Credit is created and put into investment in the physical productive powers of China, but now more and more into more and more parts of the world. 2008 had the first spacewalk by taikonaut. 2013 you had the landing of the U-2 rover on the moon, and in 2050 we should have America, China, India, Japan, Europe. Everybody should be involved in building this city on the moon and working towards the city on Mars as well. But it requires that everybody's working together. And so once again, we have to come back to what we have to do today, because none of these things make any sense unless you realize what we have to do today. We still have this British Empire. It's collapsing all over the place, but you have to realize what you're dealing with, as it says up there, and you have to have the idea that, here I've got a quote from Confucius up there, that the pursuit of truth is the main thing that has to be brought forward, and we have to talk to people. We have to bring forth contradictions. That's sort of what Confucius and Socrates were very good at doing. So for example, if people are attacking Trump as being the new Hitler or whatever they want to say he is, if that is what he is, then why is he ending wars? I mean, you just have to, because you can't force anybody to discover the truth, but you can create the contradictions so that in people's minds, so that they don't have to learn via the school of hard knocks, which is sort of the Aristotelian way, not to know anything in advance. So this, by the way, this is at the top of our little mountain in Herman Park. If you think in terms of a year, plant a seed. If in terms of 10 years, plant trees. If in terms of 100 years, teach the people. Confucius. Anyway, so China's had beneficial influence on the United States. The United States has had beneficial influence on China, and improving this relationship and getting us out of the influence of the British Empire and all of their organized warfare is something we need to do. So that's the end of my slides there. I don't know. Well, we do teach some Mandarin, but it's not the most studied. It's not mandatory, and it's not the most studied. Yeah. So any thoughts or yeah, go ahead.
So when about a month ago, it was Trump was coming down real hard on China, right? On
Yeah.
the trade. I mean, and now it's a love fest, as he says. But
Right.
I recall that in his denunciation of China, in front of what body, or maybe it was when it looked like everything was just on the rocks. Trump came out and blasted China for subsidizing their industries, you know, like this was some criminal communist act, you know, and yet the history of America, of course, you know, with the railroad and everything else, was the government played a very prominent
Right,
role.
if you want something to be done, you gotta make it easy to do it.
Right.
You try to make it as hard as possible.
Well, under Bush and Obama, we were shutting down, we weren't subsidizing our own industries, we were shutting them down.
Right.
Subsidizing the banks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Would you say that Nixon's policy towards China was kind of cynical in that he wanted to pit the Soviet Union against China? Because it wasn't that long after they had the Sino-Soviet War
Right.
that he was. I was just wondering whether it was an idealistic motive or whether it was.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's probably not easy thing for me to say one way or the other, but I had the idea that he did have idealistic ideas in mind, but
Did
he
Kissinger
was
share
a
those?
Kissinger had other ideas, and the British had even further ideas.
Don't forget
So,
George Bush.
Yeah.
So I can't say, but I will say that if you read The Making of the President, 1968, Theodore White, who was, you know, I don't know if you can trust him or not, but he talks in there about, before he was elected, discussions that he had with Nixon about China and what his intentions were, and he was saying something to the effect that if you could stop the conflicts, he would like to talk with, you know, some kind of relationship could be developed with China. And so he had that in mind over a long period of time. And it wasn't just Kissinger was the one who had the idea that, well, we're going to balance of power, because Kissinger believed in the balance of power and this and that. But Nixon was a little different, I think. I mean, could be wrong. Go ahead.
How did the, you know, I mean, what ultimately came out of the development of the U.S.-China relationship under Nixon in that period is this massive exploitation of cheap labor.
Right.
And so, you know, I was just wondering how that emerged. You know, where was Nixon on that? I mean, he was the guy that took the dollar off gold. You know, he's the guy that opened the door for this crazy,
Right.
you know,
Well,
global dollar.
Right. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to give you I can't give you a perfect analysis of that. I would just say that that was something that took a long time to take off. It didn't just happen then. It took off much later. And as the president, our current president says, it was not really something that was done by China. It was something that was done by the policy of the British and Wall Street interests, whose policy is controlled disintegration of the United States in world economy, really, what they meant as Europe and the American industrial economy. Because if you go back to the slide we had there of Aristotle and Socrates, Aristotle's British, he's the icon for British ways of thinking. His ideas were that if you were born, if your father was a carpenter, you have to be a carpenter. You know, that everything should be static, that there should be no progress, there should be no, you know, and so the imperial way of thinking is that whatever happens, you got to maintain the status quo. And so they're outraged by the American Revolution, they're outraged by scientific progress, they're outraged by industry, and shouldn't be a surprise that Mark Carney is there saying, well, credit will only go to people who are going to build windmills, you know, 14th century technology, right? You know, there's no going to.
Are you the one that said we have to defeat Trump at all costs?
Well, the defeat Trump at all costs, that was the House of Lords
Oh,
committee that was studying foreign relations, right?
oh, I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Helga Zepp-LaRouche wrote, when she was in China, she gave an excellent speech about, this was just a couple months ago when we published it, and I think, wondering how we could get that to the president, to the American president because she was trying to tell China, you know, why Americans are acting the way they are. I don't remember exactly if I'm formulating this correctly,
Right.
but it's the first thing I've seen of trying to help the Chinese people understand what the Americans' attitude toward China, and that we want cooperation, that we have many commonalities, but the thing that's driving these wedges are the British imperial policies. And I think if the people in the White House read that speech, or if somehow that speech could get around, that was one of the best things to promote U.S.-China relations, and that it's the British that are trying to destroy our relations.
Yeah, but we have succumbed to the free trade ideology and the idea that Wall Street is the best decision maker. Wall Street is not a good decision maker.
I know, but there's
So
people
you have
in
to
the
have the
US who
four
don't,
laws.
but without
There's-
our organization and our forces in the U.S. are not promoting that. We're not promoting that Wall Street. We're promoting what Helga said in her speech.
Right. Yes, this is the big vulnerability of the president, is the fact that we still have Wall Street running around making these decisions, and so he's trying to build up American industry, but if we don't have a credit system, we don't have credit going to build things. You have situations like housing, you know. Just yesterday I was walking to the bank and I get a phone call and somebody wants to buy my house, you know. And that, you know, it's just you know, they're like dying to buy houses.
Right.
It's they say my house is, which we paid $44,000 for, they say it's $128,000. And they said, well, what the, you know, this is pure speculation. It's totally predatory. It's totally against the interests of, and similar things going on in Hong Kong. That's part of the thing that was used to create unrest there, because the financial speculation on real estate, which can be regulated, you don't have to allow that kind of wild stuff going on, but it makes it impossible for young people to live. Go ahead.
Two things. One is that, actually I was just trying to find it, I can't find it right now, but we do have a petition on our website circulating on stopping the persecution, if you will, of against Chinese students and
Right.
professors and so forth coming into the United States, which I think is very important, because when people, I mean, what you just presented was quite fascinating, because it's also, people have a tendency of looking at this history from the standpoint of trying to figure out little pockets, but it is very much this question of, you know, top down, you know, how these long arcs of relationships have worked out, how there's been manipulation from the outside, which you kept coming back to, the British manipulation. But in the center of that, you find, well, Lyndon LaRouche was instrumental throughout a lot of that process, which was very important, that you kept showing the wealth of knowledge in our Executive Intelligence Review magazine, the Silk Road reports, and if people, this is my plug also, are not avid readers, I noticed that, I'm like, wow, he's using those reports very well, are not avid readers and subscribers to the Executive Intelligence Review, I would encourage you to do so, because you can learn more about this. But you know, it's just fascinating, because it is, you know, we were just discussing, you know, what's the role, how was Nixon thinking, or how was this process working. But what you were just presenting here is, you had pockets of leadership who came in and really demonstrated a different conception of mankind, different conception of what wealth and relationships should really look like, from Sun Yat-sen to what was done in Lincoln, you know, these various people, and you're always going to have that. So it's, you know, interesting to look at these things from historic perspective, top down, who's actually manipulating and controlling things, and how are people responding to that.
Right. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just based on your opinions, I just wondering, you know, how do you feel like the relationship between China and America in the probably in the next 10 years or 20 years?
Oh, it should be very close. There should be cooperation in space program, cooperation in a lot of different areas. China could help the United States very much in building up our rail infrastructure and certain other things which Chinese have become the experts in the world at, you know. You'd see that the thing is that right now the old order is crumbling all over the place, and you know, every day if you turn on the TV or if you just get blasted by propaganda you wouldn't believe about China, about the president, about you know, whatever it is they're saying is probably a lie, you know, and so people don't pay too much attention to it anymore. More and more people are realizing that there's psychosis that has nothing to do with reality. But there are big problems in the United States. We have the problem that we still don't have our industry the way it should be. Our scientists are, in China, if you have an idea, you go to the bank and they'll give you the money to build whatever your idea is if you can prove that you know what you're doing. But in the United States, you can have a great idea and somebody's going to figure out how to take your company away from you, even if you're able to build something. What's that?
If it
Or even if it doesn't emit CO2, they're still going to try to screw you. But they certainly want to destroy what's left of American. I mean, the United States used to be the center of industrial capacity in the world, and it's been hacked up. And the same thing has been done in Europe, in Germany in particular. I mean, it's just incredible what's happened to Germany, because they're basically committing national suicide, shutting down their nuclear power, then they're shutting down their coal power, and then they're going to try to live off of, if you drive through Bavaria, as I've done recently, the roadsides are just filled with solar collectors everywhere. But there's no way that you can run industrial, you know, like a steel mill has to run 24 hours a day. You can't just shut it off and then fire up your, you know, you have to run. There are certain things that require 24-hour-a-day heavy input of electricity, and there's no way that you're going to store enough battery power to run a steel mill overnight, things like that, you know, not to mention.
Ironically, one of those things is the Bitcoin, you know,
Yeah.
the servers that they're running this fake Bitcoin currency on.
Right.
And it's the Morgenthau plan that was proposed at the end of World War II
Right.
to pastoralize Germany, to destroy its industrial capability so that it would never be a military threat again, supposedly.
Right.
You know.
Well, you know, that's basically that there was, in order for Germany to be reunified, Germany, the Chancellor Kohl, who was Chancellor at the time, had to agree to conditions placed on him by Margaret Thatcher from Britain and President Mitterrand of France and Old Man Bush, the American president at the time, and basically meant that Germany had to give up its sovereignty in terms of being able to create credit. So now you have the European Central Bank. They're the only people that can create credit. But worse than that, you had the deliberate creation of this Green Party and spread of the eco-fascist philosophy, which is hard for people in China to understand. And it's hard for any normal person to understand, but it's just been pounded and pounded and pounded into people. And in Germany, people don't have the idea of fighting back. They have the idea that whoever's in power is going to do whatever they want to do, and you have to try to figure out how to survive. I mean, it's just, I mean, that's the difference between the United States and Europe, okay? In Europe, it's always been the case that there are certain people, certain families, they're going to be the ones that make the decisions, and you just have to figure out how to get by whatever decisions they make. They're going to go to war, not go to war, have industry, not industry. You got to figure out how to survive, but you can't control it. In the United States, people say, "What the hell? We're not going to take this crap anymore." No. so you get revolts. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask a question about as far as future U.S.-China relations.
Yeah.
Do you think they're good? Because I was thinking that I think they are good, because in 1992, when LaRouche, you know, proposed the land bridge and the development, you know, he's been proposing it all along, but he always said during that time, you know, we have, you know, he had optimism, but he always used to talk about the Bush Thatcher, Gorbachev, Mitterrand, you know, you had this terrible alliance,
Yeah.
but you had people in China, people here and there that were pushing for development. And then when Xi launched the Belt and Road Initiative, and then when all this stuff came about, you had good leadership. In China, you had Xi, because LaRouche then started talking about the four powers: U.S., Russia, China, and India.
Right.
Four powers for development. Doesn't include the British.
Right.
But you had for a few years, you had, you know, China was moving forward with Xi, India was moving forward with Modi, or he might not have, I don't know when he exactly came in, but Russia was definitely moving forward with Putin, because
Right.
he kicked out all the oligarchs and developed Russia. But in the U.S., during that whole time, we had Obama, you know, we had, and the remnants
Right.
of Bush
Right.
and Obama. So now, do you think that's more optimistic with the election of Trump? Because during his campaign, and I think one of the reasons he got elected is because he said he wants to have good relations with Russia and China, and he kept
Right.
saying that. He says that at all of his rallies. He
Right.
says that. He says, you know, even though he like makes jabs at China about manufacturing, and they're doing this to us, you know, which there's, you know, truth and falsity on both sides of it. But he says he wants to get along. He doesn't blame China. He blames the stupid policies that we've had in America,
That's
and
right.
he says he wants to have a good He says he wants to have a good relationship with Xi. He's my
Right.
personal friend, and
Right.
you know, he's got this relationship with Kim. I was reading someplace that, you know, foreign leaders love Trump, and for 2 whole years in America, you know, we've had this stupid hoax against him, and he's been kind of. But when he gets away from the news media and the craziness in Washington, and he goes and meets, like he had the meeting in Singapore, and
Right.
he had the meeting over at, and when he met with Xi at the latest meetings, and during the trade deal, he says he's going to have another meeting with Xi when they have the G7 in Chile. It's coming up later on this month, or in November. So, but I think when Trump gets away from all that insanity of Washington and you know, the British oligarch operations against him, I think we have, you know, I think he.
Well, the
Would
role
have a
that
good-
we have to play is that we have to
Okay.
create the conditions so that he's free to do these things, and that we can implement the full LaRouche 4 Laws program that we have to have. Restoration, regulation of the banking, like they have in China. We have to have national banking, like they have in China, like we used to have. Okay, and credit to go into building up industry, but also propelling industry forward with the new technologies in fusion research, space program, things like that. Because right now in America, the credit system has got a stranglehold on industry and the future of the country. And this is coming to a head. Every night now, the Federal Reserve is putting in $70 to $100 billion worth of credit to prop up some banks, some unknown, but there's a bubble which is in the middle of popping again. And you know it when people start calling you in the middle of the day and middle of the night and say, hey, I want to buy your house. You know there's something weird going on, you know. It's not right.
Lyndon LaRouche never sat back and waited to see what was going to happen. He would promote the idea that would get us where we need to go. You know, and so the best way to assure that the relations are good is to join our fight.
Go ahead.
Oh, that high-speed picture,
Yeah.
it did have a windmill.
No, I didn't have a window. Didn't have- and even though it's super efficient, the faster you go, the more power you got to use, because unless you're running in an evacuated tube, now that's another thing which they're working on in China, is evacuated tube maglev. That's another thing, but wind resistance is big. Wind resistance drag increases as the square of the speed or something like that. I don't know what it is. Somebody knows what it is. I don't know what it is, but it's an exponential process.
To power
Is
wind resistance.
Is it the cube of it? I don't know. Anyway, it goes up very rapidly. Go ahead.
I was just going to say on the point you just brought up that you know, a lot of times we look at the top and what's wrong there, but it's really been, especially since I guess the Kennedy assassination and Martin Luther King and others, the ability for these forces to manipulate the American population on their own fears, so that They can scare people on China, they can scare people on Russian dominance, they can scare
Right.
people on what they're gonna lose if the, you know, bail out the banks. And
Right.
a lot of these kinds of ideologies are beginning to break down as well, where they just don't believe a lot of the media anymore. And what we've,
Right.
as you were saying, we play the key role in giving that awakening some kind of content and leadership. And you can swing it the other direction quite quickly, and we've been finding that in some of these rallies and things
Right.
that we've gone to. with
People
the-
have been through a lot of BS, and
Yeah.
you're getting tired of hearing it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is good. We should, just last thing, oh, you can turn that
Yeah,
off. I was
you
just
can-
gonna,
you can jump there.
I was just
Thank
gonna
you.
say too, that, Evelyn sent out something recently, just